Welcome back to Let's Read The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. This week we're looking at Chapter 11, The Cumulative Case for a Creator. This chapter is essentially a conclusion for the book and summarises the arguments that have already been made. The chapter opens with Strobel giving an extended account of what came to be known as the Ford Pinto trial. This was a case against Ford, alleging that its car, the Pinto, was unsafe and, in a particular rear-end collision, had caused the death of its occupants. Strobel spends 3 pages discussing how apparently the prosecution had felt they had an ironclad case and had challenged the defence. He then goes on to explain how the case had unravelled as the defence uncovered new evidence and ultimately Ford was acquitted. He attributes the defence's success to their investigators having followed the clues wherever they led. Strobel uses this case for 2 reasons. Firstly, because he wrote a book about it 30 years ago, and like the opening chapter, he's reminding us that he's a hard-nosed journalist who gets to the facts. And secondly, as an analogy for how his seemingly ironclad atheism was unravelled by what he says is new scientific evidence in support of Christianity. This next section is just a page about Strobel's journey from atheist to Christian, apparently taking place over 2 years up to 1981. Interestingly, he claims that at that time he was partially converted to Christianity by the scientific evidence in support of a creator. He says, even though there was less evidence than is readily available today, there was still plenty upon which to reach a verdict, using the courtroom metaphor that apologists like. I find this interesting because it seems to imply that this book is the best scientific evidence that he has for a creator, and that he was personally convinced by less. Given the poor quality of evidence presented here, it seems fair to say that Strobel was not converted to Christianity by the weight of solid scientific evidence. This section is a recap of the early chapters of the book, where Strobel argues against naturalism, which he conflates with Darwinian evolution by natural selection. He repeats this mistake by again saying that Darwinism has naturalism as its underlying premise, which is wrong, since evolution is completely compatible with the supernatural or a non-creator god. Strobel then lists what he considers are the absurdities of naturalism. Nothing produces everything, non-life produces life, randomness produces fine-tuning, chaos produces information, unconsciousness produces consciousness, non-reason produces reason. It's like a greatest hits of apologist strawmen. Just because something can be expressed in a derisive tone doesn't mean that it's false. The term Big Bang was originally coined to ridicule the idea of the cosmos expanding rapidly from a singularity, but we now know that it's correct. Strobel gives a summary of each of the previous chapters, highlighting why he thinks they prove evolution or naturalism wrong. The problem is that in each case the argument is, we have no naturalistic explanation for X, therefore X cannot be explained naturalistically. This is just an argument from ignorance. Of abiogenesis, he says, there are no viable theories. Of biological information, he claims that there are insurmountable hurdles that cannot be resolved by more research and effort. But this simply wasn't demonstrated in the book. Strobel claims that of the fossil record, the intermediaries have remained as elusive as ever, which is simply wrong. He references the Cambrian explosion, but even if current evolutionary theory couldn't explain it, that would hardly disprove evolution. That's like saying that the precession of Mercury disproves Newtonian mechanics. At best, it would show that the theory of evolution is incomplete. He then closes the chapter by quote-mining Roger Lewin from an article from a conference on evolution. Strobel uses a quote that makes it sound like Lewin is saying that macroevolution hasn't occurred, which is completely dishonest. The whole article was about scientific disagreements about the mechanisms of macroevolution, not whether it happens. And it's 30 years old, which makes it dishonest and hardly relevant. In this section, Strobel recapitulates the arguments from the previous chapters in this book. Since I've already responded to them in my previous videos, I'll just give a brief overview of my objections to them. To start with, Strobel argues that to prove God requires many arguments that make a cumulative case. I'd argue that a multitude of bad arguments, taken together, do not equal a good argument. First up, Strobel reminds us of William Lane Craig's Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe had a beginning, therefore it has a cause. The problem with this is that the first premise hasn't been established, as the laws of cause and effect that we are familiar with from inside the universe don't necessarily apply to the universe as a whole. Also, the second premise is also unproven, since it rests on equivocating between our local universe, which did begin with the Big Bang, and the entire universe, which may not have. Lastly, the conclusion doesn't prove that there was a creator, just a cause. And despite Craig's evidenceless assertions, a cause is not the same as a creator. The next argument that Strobel recaps is the apparent fine-tuning of the laws of physics. This argument is that the values of certain physical constants have been so improbably fine-tuned so as to permit life in our universe. The problem with this argument is that no one has actually established that these constants are actually fine-tuned. No one has any idea what values they could have taken and with what likelihood. Without first establishing that, it is impossible to make a case for fine-tuning. Also, most of the examples of fine-tuning are centered on life as we know it, not life in general. So to make a case for fine-tuning, one would first have to establish the impossibility of any kind of life under different conditions, and that is far from certain. Strobel then sums up the argument from the apparent fine-tuning of the conditions on Earth. The problem is that by the numbers presented in that chapter, there should be millions of other planets just like ours, let alone planets different from ours capable of supporting some other kind of life. The next argument is the argument from irreducible complexity. The idea is that if a biological system is composed of interdependent parts, all of which are required for it to function, then it couldn't have evolved. The problem with this is it's simply wrong. A simple analogy is that of an archway. Arches consist of multiple stones, all of which are required for it to stay up. But despite this, naturally occurring rock arches are not uncommon, and they have come about with no design or intention. Similarly, biological systems can, and have been shown to, evolve irreducibly complex features. Strobel then considers the argument from specified complexity, despite not actually calling it that in the chapter. The idea here is that a complex sequence of information that corresponds to an independent function or pattern must come from an intelligence. The problem here is that this is just the same old argument from design, dressed up in fancy language. Whether DNA or other biological information actually does correspond to an independent function or pattern is precisely what's in dispute, just as whether the complexity of a life form actually is analogous to a watch. The final argument that Strobel covers is the argument from consciousness. The idea here is that there is some aspect of human consciousness or mental activity that cannot be explained naturalistically. That is, there is some mental phenomenon that cannot be accounted for by the brain alone. The problem with this is that no one has actually managed to provide any such phenomenon. All the examples proposed so far, potentially, can be accounted for naturalistically. The other point Strobel argues is that consciousness couldn't have arisen from non-conscious material. But this is as stupid as saying that fire couldn't have arisen from non-burning material. In the next section, Strobel moves from having, in his opinion, established that there is a creator, to considering what qualities this creator must have. And he starts off by returning to William Lane Craig. The cause of the universe must be an uncaused, beginningless, timeless, immaterial, personal being endowed with freedom of will and enormous power. This isn't correct. If the Kalam cosmological argument was sound, it would only establish that the cause was itself uncaused, beginningless, and possibly timeless, if by that you mean outside of our local sense of time. It doesn't establish that the cause doesn't have its own sense of time. that it's immaterial, that it's a personal being, or that it has free will or enormous power. There's one physics model that has our universe coming from a quantum fluctuation, and this model is compatible with the cosmological argument. But a quantum vacuum is hardly a personal being with free will and enormous power. Strobel then argues that the Earth's place in the cosmos implies that the Creator must care for us and want us to explore the universe. But the fact that we find ourselves in a livable habitat isn't surprising, since we could hardly expect to find ourselves anywhere else, regardless of the characteristics of the Creator. And the idea that the Creator must want us to explore the universe is belied by our position within the galaxy, which is hardly ideal for observing our galaxy, let alone the rest of the universe. Strobel then goes on to argue that since, on his account, the Creator must have intervened in our evolution, this disproves a deistic or pantheistic God. Of course, the God that he's gunning for is the Christian God, and to this end he gives several Bible quotes to show that his preferred God lines up perfectly with the characteristics he's argued for. It fits so perfectly that it's almost as if the arguments have been tailored to his preferred conclusion. The rest of this section is just boring theology, so I'm going to skip it. The next section is Strobel arguing that atheists misunderstand faith, and that actually faith and science go hand in hand. To make this point, he defines faith like this. I see faith as being a reasonable step in the same direction that the evidence is pointing. In other words, faith goes beyond merely acknowledging that the facts of science and history point towards God. It's responding to those facts by investing trust in God, a step that's fully warranted due to the supporting evidence. This kind of wordplay is typical of apologists who want to distance themselves from definitions of faith that make it irrational. The problem is that it's dodging the real problem with faith. The fundamental question is whether the strengths of your beliefs are strictly in line with the evidence. Any belief that goes beyond the evidence, even a little, is faith. And any amount of faith cannot be justified. Taking a reasonable step in the same direction that the evidence is pointing is by definition irrational. As Hume said, we should apportion our beliefs to the evidence, and I'd say neither more nor less than what the evidence supports. Strobel then quotes Alistair McGrath, who says something stupid about the truth claims of atheism, as if there were any. The rest of the section is just quotes from people claiming that their faith doesn't conflict with science because their interpretation of science confirms their faith. And then he finishes up with some theology about how religious knowledge demands a response or something like that. The final three sections of this chapter are an extended telling of the story of Viggo Olsen. Olsen is an agnostic doctor turned missionary surgeon, and the story of his conversion to Christianity closely matches Strobel's own narrative. In particular, Strobel wants to highlight the inquiry and journey of discovery that Olsen and his wife took. Much of this is the familiar narrative and held little interest to me, but one point I thought telling. When discussing his actual reasons for conversion, Olsen tells of how he came home from work with what he describes as a powerful argument against Christianity. He then explains this objection to his wife, who confesses that she's converted and believes in God. In response to this, Olsen apparently also converted. Objection unanswered. In this book, this incident is told as an example of the emotional power of Christianity, but it seems to me to be a good demonstration of how Olsen's conversion was not actually based on rational argumentation, despite his claims to the contrary. Olsen outlines three questions that he asked himself when investigating Christianity. First, is there a God who created the universe? Second, did God reveal himself to humankind through the Bible or other sacred scriptures? Third, is Jesus the Son of God, deity united with humanity, and can he help us as he claimed? These are reasonable questions, all of which would have to be answered in the affirmative for Christianity to be true. But even a generous reading of this book would show that there's no reason to think that there's a creator God. The whole argument from design is simply an argument from ignorance and an argument from analogy. no one's managed to put forth a positive case for design that doesn't boil down to, it looks designed, so it must be, combined with, there's no natural explanation for this. We've had 300 odd pages of this book, and not a single decent argument for the existence of a creator god. And we're not even halfway to answering the first of Olson's questions in the affirmative, and Strobel's acting as though his religious beliefs were based on science. And that's it for this section, this chapter, and this book. The rest of the book contains a summary of another of Strobel's books, The Case for Christ, which I'm not going to cover, since others have already covered that book in depth. Before finishing, I want to make a few concluding remarks about why, as a layperson, I feel comfortable dismissing intelligent design arguments. Firstly, the overwhelming majority of qualified experts are not convinced by these arguments. In the pages of science journals, intelligent design is not seriously considered. Experts in the field routinely respond to intelligent design books and find nothing in them to be compelling. As a layperson, I find it pragmatic to rely on the consensus of experts, and here the consensus is clear. Secondly, all of the arguments for intelligent design come from recent scientific advances. From Big Bang cosmology to the intricacies of cells to neuroscience, the research that Strobel and others cite as being supportive of a creator invariably comes from new fields that have yet to develop anything close to a complete theory explaining their results. The gaps in knowledge in these fields are what apologists claim support their God. But more compelling to me would be if a particular scientific result had been known for centuries and still supported a theistic conclusion. Don't claim that it's time to consider supernatural explanations when these fields of science have barely had a couple of generations working in them. Thirdly, intelligent design arguments undermine much of what is claimed for the Christian God. The Christian God didn't skillfully hide evidence of his existence in subtle aspects of the universe because he knew that 2,000 years after Jesus, our civilization would have advanced sufficiently to discover them. According to the Bible, and most Christians, there are compelling reasons for belief in their God that's been available to us since Jesus. The God of intelligent design is not the God of the Bible. Anyway, that's it for this video, and that's it for this series. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. See you next time. Bye.